All right, viewers and listeners, past, present, and future, welcome to another episode of the Spin Doctors. We're going to be keeping it short today, and we're going to be talking about just a couple of case studies that Bruce and I have worked on just picking the right frame and the right messaging for your campaign, and trying to decide between two different framings and messages and stuff like that. Um, yeah, but Bruce, do you have anything to say before we kind of jump into our case studies, examples that we want to share?
Oh, I would just sort of remind people, especially anybody who was not clever enough to watch our first two episodes, to think about VPSA, Values, Problem, Solution, Action, because that's a really good underlying structure for just about everything I think we're going to be talking about.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so the first thing, the story I want to talk about is actually when I was a Sierra Club organizer. So it was a couple years after my time at Greenlining. It was 2014. And I got hired as a community organizer, and it's a separate story, but I went to go work in Richmond for Team Richmond, and this was in 2014 when Chevron spent over $4 million to win the city council election. This was 2 years after a big refinery incident and accident sent over 15,000 people to the hospital. It was a big, big issue. But that is a story for another time. The story I want to talk about was when I worked at the Sierra Club. Sierra Club, great environmental organization. Their biggest charge at the time, they look to protect and conserve and the conservation efforts, which is protect our wildlife, our natural ground, our natural environment, our forests. And they were very big, and therefore they are very big on climate change. And this was in 2014. So climate change has not officially become like relevant. There was still a lot of pushback in terms of, yes, there's one side where they're saying that climate change isn't true or isn't false. And then working with politicians, people were still hesitant to really jump on measures. And to an extent, they still are today to jump on measures to stop fossil fuel production and really help with the transition to a more sustainable climate. So I was a climate change organizer essentially. And the assignment that I had was to help build a coalition to address refinery pollution in the Bay Area. So in the Bay Area, there's 5 refineries. And at that time, our campaign was to cap refinery pollution where they're at. And the reason why that was important, it was because it would have stopped the oil industry from bringing in tar sands into the Bay Area. So long story short, refineries, there's different types. There's medium grade refineries, heavy grade duty refineries in the Bay Area in California, where we have more of the medium grade ones. So the refining that they do, the oil is pre-refined somewhat before it gets to the refineries in the Bay Area. And for refining, it's like a science project. If you heat stuff up, the lighter stuff goes to the top, the heavier stuff goes to the bottom. So the lighter stuff is gasoline, so that's the gasoline that we use, and the heavier stuff is all the crap and crud that gets there. So tar sands, unlike your regular barrel of oil, is like really tar and sand put together. And so you can already imagine how intense the refining would have to be. So in order for the Bay Area refineries to refine tar sands, they would have to upgrade their equipment, locking in the Bay Area in for much more worse pollution for decades to come. And so that was our strategy to prevent worse situations of climate change. As a community organizer, I had to go into Richmond, a community that was not familiar with the Sierra Club. And so I had a choice to make. The climate change was not resonating with community members. When I would go knock on doors, people were like, sure, whatever. They didn't really, they agreed with me in the moment, but they weren't going to take action. They weren't going to join. They weren't going to participate. They weren't going to share anything. It's climate change. It just felt too far away. And so going back into our VPSA, and one of the things I help clients with is to really acclimate to this model and learn how to value match. how to identify your audience and identify what your audience values and then value match that. And so the community in Richmond, yes, were they concerned about climate change? Absolutely. If you look at Richmond now, it's a community that is on the forefront of addressing their refinery. They recently had a victory in Richmond where Chevron will be paying over $550 million over the next 10 years for the pollution that they've been putting onto the community. So it's fantastic work, but a lot of that work has been built upon a lot of organizing. But in 2014, one of the things I contributed was to really reframe our campaign to be one that was about the environment and more about health. So really, really to focus on the health impacts. What's the health impacts of the refinery? How many years less do we live in Richmond because we live next to Chevron? And that flew out to everything. We went out to partner with the California Nurses Association, the Physicians for Social Responsibility. We identified that we had vulnerable community members and populations. So young kids, elderly, these were all folks who were going to be able to be impacted, not just from refinery pollution, but any type of pollution. And so that really changed how I approached almost any type of organizing that I did with the Sierra Club. So I really looked at what was the community, what were they going to value? They were going to value their health, they value the economy, and being able to talk to them in that frame, it was a lot easier to be able to get them on board and have them join a broad coalition to advocate for refinery, for capping refinery pollution. And yeah, and so I say that because a lot of times if you're listening to this, you're probably in a advocacy organization and you're trying to think about what is our message. And to start with that message, it's to know who are your audience? Who's your audience? Who are the decision makers? What do they value? What do they care about? And then crafting your message from there.
So that's really interesting, and it's actually really parallel to the story I was going to tell. So maybe I'll make this one brief, and maybe we'll have a chance to sneak in one more.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, but a few years before your situation in Richmond, um, uh, in the middle of 2010, the Greenlining Institute uh, joined a coalition that was opposing a proposition that had been put on the California ballot by two out-of-state energy oil companies that was basically designed to gut California's climate law. It's called the Global Warming Solutions Act, had been passed a couple of years prior, and it, for the first time, committed the state to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and started the ball rolling on creating a mechanism for doing that. Um, Fossil fuel companies obviously didn't like this. And two, interestingly, not the big guys, not Chevron or Exxon or Shell, but two companies from Texas, Tesoro and Valero, got an initiative on the ballot to basically gut that law. And the big, generally white-dominated environmental groups were, of course, mounting a campaign against it. We and some of our allies had the feeling that these groups weren't necessarily that good at communicating with communities of color. So we created our own coalition to do grassroots outreach specifically to those communities. And I at Greenlining and the folks at Ella Baker Center in Oakland had the lead on the communications aspect of this. And we ended up in very much the same place that you did a few years later, not wanting to completely gloss over climate change, but recognizing it was not the first thing on the minds of the communities that we were going to be talking to. And so we built a message. We ended up branding the thing the dirty energy proposition, and emphasized health. And we all want to live in a clean environment, breathe clean air that's good for our kids. And these out-of-state oil companies, these Texas oil companies, want to take that away from us to fatten their profits. And it worked. I'm not going to claim that our little coalition gets all the credit, but we clobbered them. it ended up polling so badly that somewhere in early September, give or take a little, the oil companies basically pulled the plug and stopped putting new money into the campaign. Um, so, and this does bring up something that I wanted to mention because sometimes you have to make these pragmatic choices that are very frustrating. I mean, I do think in an ideal world, people would understand more about climate change and various organizations and campaigns would be doing a more and a better job of educating people about it. But the problem, particularly with electoral campaigns or anything that's got sort of a time limit to it, is you got to do what works. And what works often is not the idealistic big picture thing that you would like to be educating people about. And it's always a frustrating choice. Um, but sometimes you have no choice unless you have endless time or endless budget. And I will say um, that kind of leads me, if I can use this as a segue, into some of my earlier work when I was at the Marijuana Policy Project, when were able to frame a long-term effort aimed at changing underlying public attitudes, because we realized that's what we had to do. Um, the then I joined them in at the end of 2001 when the idea of legalizing cannabis was not really on the radar screen. It was still thought of as sort of a wild and radical idea. I mean, literally the first time I called CNN to try and pitch them a story when I was in this job, and I said I'm from the Marijuana Policy Project, the person who answered the phone laughed out loud at the name of the organization. You know, that's how unseriously we were being taken. And that was because for three-quarters of a century, people had heard this story only from one frame. Marijuana is bad. It hurts our kids. We have to ban it and crack down to keep it away from them. And so we faced the issue of having to just completely change that conversation, even as we were working on smaller, more pragmatic campaigns and reforms. And what we ended up doing is highlighting a couple things. Number one is this doesn't work. The government's own surveys were showing that half of the country had used marijuana, that high school kids repeatedly reported that it was easier to get than cigarettes. So, A, you've got a policy that's costing a whole pile of money that's not doing anything. And then we had to focus on the harm that it does. Because when you prohibit something like marijuana, you don't make it go away. We've learned that. We learned it with alcohol in the 1920s. What you do is you hand over the market to unregulated criminals. Um, so the other thing that we would say is if you think marijuana is bad, why do you want it completely unregulated? Why do you want it produced and sold by people who have zero incentive not to sell to kids? Because their incentive is to make as much money as fast as they can and get the hell away from law enforcement. And over time, it took a while, but over time it started to sink in. And by the time that I left there 8 years later, um, full-fledged legalization proposals were on the cusp of passing and started to pass very soon after. I will mention one other thing, just in terms of framing and in terms of word choice, because the word or slogan you use can be very important. We never used the word legalization. We said tax and regulate, so that you put in positive associations with what you're doing. Hey, we want some control over this, and we want to get the tax revenue this huge industry produces. And again, over time, it took a while, but it worked. Again, we knew we had time. We knew we weren't going to do what we wanted overnight. And that's very different from an election campaign when you got a hard deadline. Oh, election is November 5th. It doesn't matter if you convince people next January.
Yeah, yeah. What a great job that y'all did in terms of just being able to take on that narrative and that challenge. Because a lot of us will not. I don't know. I don't know how many of us know Reefer Madness and Nixon. propaganda campaign. But sometimes you do need to dismantle an existing message and then replace it with a stronger message, right? Yeah, and that's kind of what I heard there. And then yeah, but for electoral campaigns, completely different. I think there's so much other dynamics that come into play in terms of who the candidate is, how likable that candidate is, how appealing they are, as well as their message. Are there any tips that you have for folks to like, let's say, like, let's see, how would you like, what kind of tips would you give people? I mean, we already talked about the value problem solution action, but what other tips can we give people for like defining their message?
So, I mean, I've said a couple of things. One is it certainly helps if you have access to research or have the budget to do research and understand really where people are. If you can't do that, watch the stories that are leading the news, see what's getting attention. It's a good chance that that's at least what the hunk of people who pay attention to news are thinking about. And actually, I can give an example of that from the marijuana efforts I was talking about. Um, Maybe the most successful thing we did fairly late in my tenure there um, was in 2009. We put together a TV commercial that we aired in California. And this was, in the depths of the Great Recession, budget crisis, et cetera. And what we did is we found the most wholesome wholesome looking older woman we could find, somebody who could be your mom, your neighbor, your aunt, whatever, uh, and shot her in a living room in a cozy, warm, homey set. Um, and after a few quick slides that showed the budget cuts that California was looking at, that cuts to healthcare and schools and all sorts of things because of the recession and the budget crisis. We cut to her sitting in her living room, just looking at the camera, saying, I'm a marijuana consumer. And I wish I could pay taxes on my purchases to help stave off these terrible budget cuts. But I can't because the law won't let me. Isn't it time we tried something different? And we had a small budget, so we could only air it a little bit. But it caught the eye of the Associated Press and went from there all over the country. It went viral like before viral was a term. We ended up on the Today Show, on the ABC Evening News. I did interviews on CNN, um, and it took off like a rocket because we were putting things in a frame that most people had never heard. And if you bring a new angle to something that relates to what's going on in their lives, but forces them to kind of look at, oh, I haven't seen anything like that before. That can be the thing that gets you in the door.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, well, we'll definitely have to do another episode on just breaking down different frames and frames to use because like, just from hearing you talk, some of the frames that I hear or that I comprehend and understand is like fairness and economic stewardship, just being able to point out that the government's wasting money or losing a big opportunity and then just like the fairness of it all, in terms of just like decriminalization doesn't help anybody, but the taxation and being able to take those taxes and putting it into social programs. Yeah, brilliant move, brilliant move. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right that in general, fairness is something that always resonates with people, and practical concerns.
yeah.
So those are things to think about. And you're absolutely right. This is a subject we could go on for hours, uh, and probably that would bore people to tears if we did it all in one. Follow-up.
Yeah, I think the other thing I wanted to add too is to double down on the research component. And yeah, it's so hard sometimes to get grassroots funding and funding for canvassing. But if you can do it, if you can even if you can do it on a volunteer basis, it's so powerful to have those one-on-one conversations with your community to get a really great sense of where the community is at, what they're feeling. And that in an election year, especially when if you're not an elected official, if you're not part of the Democratic Party or part of the Republican Party, in which a large majority of the country is rather turned off by politics or identify as independent, they're so fed up with the system, but you still want to help the community. One of the ways that you can take advantage of these elections is that if there is a coalition in your community, how can the coalition go out and canvass the community, solicit what are the needs of the community, and then hold a candidates forum with that type of information. And so back in 2017, I organized the Richmond People's Assembly, and that's what we did. So I was the coordinator of the Richmond Our Power Coalition, and we went out to survey. And this was something I learned from organizers in Buffalo, New York, where we would go out and canvass with one question and one question only. What's been your biggest problem? What's been your biggest issue? And from there, we've heard about all types of things, the lack of economic opportunity, health and finances, safety, just trash on the street. And we took all of these information and we synthesized it into different issue areas. And then we held the Richmond People's Assembly. We brought over 200 people. We surveyed over 1,000 people. And then later we held a candidates forum. And then we invited all the candidates who were running for election and asked them these questions. And what ended up happening was we were able to reframe the campaign and the election of Richmond with those issues in mind. And then afterwards, when the candidates took office, they were able to take on those issues. We cleaned up the streets. The whole dumping issue was like, and these were issues that were not talked about, that were not that you wouldn't have found in the media. But because we went out to the community, got those issues, brought them into there, we were able to impact and make some change.
Yeah, and it certainly helps anything you can do like that to clarify your understanding of where your audience is coming from. And it strikes me that Richmond is probably sort of a textbook example of where people feel sort of buffeted by different things. There are huge economic and practical needs at the same time, a serious pollution problem, often from companies that provide a lot of local jobs. So there's a lot of complex forces at work, in the community and in people's heads, I would.
Yeah. Yeah. And then going back on brand selection, I mean, the picking of the name, there was one of the, so my task was to figure out the different issues. And so one of the issues was public safety. And when I came up for the name for the workshop and for the group, I was deciding between two different names. The first one I wanted to go with was redefining public safety. And then the second one was reimagining public safety. So I wanted to go with redefining public safety because the word defining means to change in words, so to change in laws. So I wanted us to have that concept of redefining public safety. But I ended up going with reimagining public safety, which ended up creating the Reimagine Richmond movement and things like that. And the reason why was Disney. Disney had really taken on the word imagine, right? Imagineers and imagine this, imagine what, there's an association with Disney about that. And so I ended up going with reimagining public safety because that imagine was just going to have a little bit more broader appeal. And sure enough, that it was catchy. It's caught on, and the people started to move towards it, and it became its own thing.
Yeah. I would imagine, and I don't say this from any knowledge, but just sort of seat of the pants guesswork, that even beyond the Disney connection, that Imagine just has a slightly more positive vibe than Define.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, Define may have been more precise in terms of what exactly you were doing, but Imagine just sort of feels, like sunshine and rainbows and good stuff, which is probably where you want people to go.
Yeah. 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 Got to think about the vibes.
Vibes matter. It's frustrating sometimes, but they do.
Yeah. And Bruce, your other point on pragmatism versus, idealism, I think that's true too when you're thinking about who's your audience, because our community members is one audience, but elected officials, they're a whole other audience. And when you're talking to decision makers, I think that's another big thing. It's not necessarily you want to appeal to decision makers, but you want to take into account who are their supporters, who can move the levers for them, and what do they care about. And a lot of times, elected officials, they care about their legacy. So sometimes if you can insert in how their support impacts their legacy, I find that it's helpful.
You know, I think you just nailed a future subject, which is advocacy campaigns specifically directed at legislators,
Yeah.
because that's a whole world unto itself.
Yes.
Boy,
Yes.
did I tell you some stories about that.
Yeah, yeah, that was good times. That was good times. Bruce, before we sign off here for today, is there anything else you want to say?
I would just say keep watching the Spin Doctors and tell all your friends.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we have lots of episodes coming up. I mean, we're going to be trying to do this every week. And so if you, as an audience member, have anything you want to contribute, we'll probably do an episode on it if you like.
That's right. Let's hear those ideas.
All right. All right. Take care, everybody. See you all next time.
See ya.